But Jeremy, you have been pinned, and you are going to lead us into a world of wonder.
Fantastic. So just let me know what you guys think for sound. I'm just gonna...
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
That's good, yeah.
This is just a square wave. Nothing happening to it, just at its purest form. This is in subtractive synthesis what we would start with before we start to filter out, much like in mastering when you're EQing. The traditional filter for the synthesizer is a ladder filter, which once we start applying, will start to remove some of that color from the sound and give us something a little bit cleaner. I'm going to just start going through, slowly filtering out. In Subtractive, we'd be amplifying that removed sound to keep getting our tone. So I'm just going to go up in the volume a little bit here. And again, just you can keep removing some of those aggressive tones from there.
Better.
Okay. Fantastic. I wasn't going to go through a whole lot more with the subtractive synthesis, because then we're going more into the details of how this specific synthesizer works and how the synthesis method is used. But this guy is definitely one of my favorites. In additive synthesis, we're going to go more to the O coast here.
Okay.
It uses a bass frequency as a tone, and then we start adding frequencies to the bass frequency by adding the overtones in. So I'm just gonna bring us right to a mixture of the overtones as well as the fundamental frequency that we're getting. As we start adding those overtones, you guys will start hearing that the sound gets slightly more interesting. Once you've added those overtones in and your sound is much thicker, it's similar to what I felt the oscillator sound out of the subtractive synthesis method sounded like, but we continue to add in additive synthesis by multiplying those overtones and getting a much harsher and more aggressive, rich sound. Going back to its fundamental frequency. And I think that's basically all I really have to say between how these two synthesizers kind of compare in the way that synthesis happens within the synthesizer. Everything after that is a whole lot of knob twisting fun. And
you're working on a piece of music. Do you what makes you go, oh, let's go additive? Is there something that guides you towards going additive outside of subtractive? Or because you said both of them can kind of end up sounding the same, but why would you choose one over the other?
I wouldn't say exactly both of them sound the same. I think one is great if you're looking for a much more harmonically rich sound. I would go more additive synthesis. Whereas if I'm looking for something a little bit cleaner, like typically I know that if I want a nice clean bass sound for a bass line in a song, I would probably go subtractive, just because I know I can get a much smoother bass. Whereas if I'm looking for something that's quite aggressive and harsh as a bass line, I would be going for the O coast, an additive synthesis method. I think I rarely think about how I choose certain instruments to do certain things. I think typically it's just all kind of taste and what I think, what I want to achieve, I think, with a specific sound or a specific song. So in terms of how many frequencies we're adding to that bass frequency, I don't know that it has a detailed amount, but I know that there's a little bit of a neat drawing here for how the multiplying of those frequencies actually works in between your bass frequency. Let me see if I can send that to the chat here.
It almost sounds like FM, kind of.
Mm.
I think FM is definitely a type of additive synthesis where you're taking all of your... FM is a whole different ballgame. I'm not sure I'd be even able to explain it all that well, but it seems like your operators are modulating themselves to get a very... It's also important to mention, I'm not sure how it chooses, but the harmonics that you're, or the frequencies that you're adding are always in relation to the original frequency that's being generated. And so...
Yeah. The no-code specifically is implemented using wave folding.
So the picture I just sent there is is an image of what the folding does to those additional...
Wasn't the Casio CZ 5000 kind of, or was that phase distortion?
That was phase distortion.
Right.
There was a Kawai K5000 or something that was supposed to be additive synthesis, but it was digital. It was, you know, big, massive rack mount, and apparently had like 5,000 parameters, and well, not that many, but it was the sort of thing where it's like, well, I'm going to program a patch. I'll see you on Monday kind of thing.
The O-Coast gets its name from taking influences from both West Coast and East Coast synthesis, which Nick was explaining to us here, which is kind of a good segue into that.
Excellent. Very smooth. Very smooth.
Yep. I actually planned for that segue.
Did you? Okay, well, you both get...
I guess the question is, what do you want to know about? Specifically, how this is different from other synthesizers like Hero Rack, or just sort of like an overview of, you know, what's Buchla and what's unique about it? What are people more kind of interested in hearing about?
I guess the latter, but I mean, that's in a sense probably going to touch on the former.
Kind of the same kind of idea. So I guess some history, again, you know, when you're talking about the East versus the West Coast, was if you ask Don, well, or Bob when they were around, like who invented the modular synthesizer, I don't think either of them would say they themselves invented it. And they usually pointed at each other when they said who brought it, you know, brought it to the, you know, the forefront first. Bob usually gets a lot more of the recognition there, but they kind of both kind of like said, no, it was you.
That's nice.
Yeah. So what's interesting is, you know, they were both kind of pioneers of their time, which kind of meant that a lot of what they were doing was unprecedented. It meant they kind of had to design things for themselves. And why that's interesting is because they had entirely different design philosophies. I wouldn't say one is better than the other, but you know, the differences definitely are quite apparent when you kind of start using them and see how they're designed to be used. You know, Moog definitely was targeting musicians that are more classically trained, in a loose term, sense of the term, you know, people familiar with keyboards, organ players, rock stars, stuff like that. Where Buchla, his designs were all around, okay, we've got technology that's really cool and new. We've got transistors. What's new? What can we do that we've never done before? And his focus was on doing new stuff, kind of like to the point of making it difficult to do the traditional stuff. You know, one thing that people always talk about is that Buchlas traditionally didn't really have ever a keyboard, and the closest thing you ever get are these touch plate keyboards. No physical keys. And, you know, some people say that was intentional because he didn't want people to play it like a piano, wanted people to try new things. But what's actually kind of interesting from a historical standpoint is that the first set of touch interfaces weren't designed to be used as a keyboard or even designed to be used for notes. It was designed to be a touch tape mixer. So what you would do is you'd have, because a lot of the background from where he came from was from tape music, because, you know, the tape machine was kind of like the new big thing that everyone was trying to do art with. So he'd say, okay, well, let's take all of our 8 or 16 tracks from this tape, plug them each into a different slot on the mixer here, and then control the mix with touch plates, depending on how much pressure you had. Now, what happened is you could use the same kind of interface to do notes, but it wasn't designed for that. It was designed initially to be a touch mixer, a touch mixer. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, you know, especially because we were coming from additive versus subtractive, is one of the biggest legacies, personally, I think, that came out of the Buchla was the 259 oscillator. And I'm just going to patch that up real quick. And what it did is it kind of was one of the very first oscillators, sound sources, to take this kind of additive approach. Let's see if we can get this going here. So you hear the plain sine wave. Does that come through okay?
Yeah, good.
Okay. And, you know, exactly like we were hearing with the no coast. Let's see, that's not, okay, that's good. Was this idea of wave folding. And this is one of the first oscillators to do that. It's got like quite a full sound to do that. So here.
Wow.
And if you keep it down really low, it gets pretty aggressive. So that was kind of one of the defining sounds of the Buchla, even though it wasn't around originally. Like the 259 is kind of a later addition. Before that, there was a 258, which was just two pretty simple oscillators that kind of focused on doing FM. And before all of this, there was the 100 series, which was kind of a proto-synth to this. So one of the things that is very different about the Buchla, obviously, well, if you've looked at one before, is it's kind of got an audio signal path, and it's got a control voltage signal path. And today, for modular synthesizers today, that's kind of weird. And here you can see two different kinds of cables. We've got the banana cables for control voltage, and that is not your normal normal audio cable here. That's not 3.5 millimeters, and it's not 1/4 inch or whatever. It's its own. It's 1/8 inch, which is different from the 3.5 or 3 1/4, whatever it is, the normal audio jacks we're used to. And the reason it uses these weird cables is because, again, unprecedented times. No one had really said, hey, this is the type of cables we're going to use for audio. Right. So Don chose this cable, and just it stuck. But what's interesting here is that the reason they're separated, one helps you kind of have a philosophical separation of control and audio, and you might like that or you might not. But the other reason is from a technical implementation standpoint, being able to do things at audio rates electronically, or at least at the time, versus doing stuff slowly, they had different trade-offs. and Dom wanted to really focus on high quality audio. So he used all the parts that made sense for audio and used very different parts for control voltage because of just the nature of the electronics at the time. One of the interesting features is there's two grounds inside here electrically. There's like a quiet ground and a noisy ground, so that, you know, if you were to use things like computers, all of that chatter that you sometimes hear about, you know, poor power sources attached to digital clocks, you don't get so much of that, which is interesting because the Buchla is also one of the first few devices to include a lot of digital stuff. One of the things that he was kind of a pioneer of is digital delays, and this was in the 70s. So digital delays weren't really a thing, but he made them a thing, and they're actually pretty cool compared to a lot of stuff that you hear today. So I'm just gonna patch this up to be so you can actually hear it more like a delay, and I'll include the delay in there. So let's take, also you can tell that it's a dirty delay. There we go. So here we've got a delay. I'm not sure how well you can see it here. It's got the dry signal, but it's got a whole bunch of different taps as well. So it's got taps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different taps, which lets you get pretty wacky. And you can start doing rhythms with your delay. And you can do stuff like have different phases on them, which if you want to get down into like really fast, you can get some like weird chorus sounds and stuff like that. Or you can slow it down and get more stuff like that. And then you can, you have to patch your own feedback if you're interested in doing feedback. So you can hear it's kind of like a pretty dirty sounding delay. So, you know, that's kind of one of the cool aspects of it, is he was kind of a pioneer in stuff that would kind of be commonplace in our time, but kind of wasn't a thing back then.
Question.
Yeah.
So it's got a delay. Is it correct to say that he integrated effects with your oscillators? Is there other stuff similar to the sort of delay type functionality?
Well, I mentioned the delay because of its digital nature.
Right.
At the time, he had to use like military grade RAM because that's all that was really available,
Right.
which made the thing obscenely expensive, which is why he only made like 4 of them.
Okay.
But they're sought after, and you can hear them in real music today even.
Okay.
But there's other effects. Here, I've got my mic actually plugged in right now. You're hearing my voice through the Buchla. So let's take advantage of that. Here's one, you know, he brought in, you know, stuff like, see if I can remember how to do this. Okay, let's see. Yeah, so he does have a lot of cool effects. So, okay, so this is let's make that a bit less extreme. So this is a frequency, what does he call it? A frequency shifter. So instead of a pitch shifter, where you take all the sound and shift it up in a way that sounds normal, this one goes from like normal sounding to like some really weird metallic sounds. And you get some really cool effects this way. Now, if I plug it on the other side, I can get very demonic, and I can summon the devil right to my studio. So you can get some really cool sounds. I'm not sure if Zoom is in stereo, but if you take one out of one side and then the one out of the other, tell me if this is in stereo or not. Now you get this word coming from both sides, and one side's going up, one side's going down. So definitely effects was a big deal here.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring some normal voice back. Also, other effects. There is a very nice reverb. So I know I'll bring in the reverb. Let's see. That's the thing about live modular demos. You got to kind of deal with all the spaghetti at once.
At least you just patch, so it's not too bad. You don't have to remember what's in where. So.
Right.
So with a Buchla, would you be able to use an oscillator as a source of modulation for something else, or because of the cabling, it needs to be CV and it needs to be audio in two separate sort of ways?
Let's see. Yeah, so you can kind of trying to get another thing to work at the same time. Oh, there we go. That's why. You can get oscillators doing modulation, but you got to kind of do it a bit differently. I'm trying to also get my. Hello? Oh, there we go. Yeah, so oscillators, the 259 was interesting because the 259 had its normal audio output, but you can see it also had, I'm not sure if you can see or not, but there's this blue output here. And the blue output is for CV. So a lot of the times, if something made sense to use the signal as modulation, they would expose it in two ways. Also, a lot of things that make sense for audio modulation would have a specific audio input for modulation. So all of the oscillators, for example, they have audio in for things like FM. So you can do your FM with other oscillators, and that was actually one of the core ideas, or not ideas, but one of the core ways of using a Buchla was its FM. Let's see if I can. It's kind of known for its FM, so may as well try and bring some in. Okay, so we've got our normal sound here. And the cool thing with the 259 is there's two oscillators in one. On the left, you've got your modulation oscillator. On the right, you've got kind of your main oscillator. And it's got a bus in between to modulate between the two of them. So it has some good FM. But you can also use this to modulate things like AM. So you can get some of those kinds of sounds as well. Or you can kind of combine them all together. So you can get some pretty narrow sounds. Another, I guess, a point that would be, it would be wrong if I didn't make it was Don was one of the first people, if not the first person, to make a step sequencer as we know it.
Oh, is that
so,
the knobs on the bottom there? The big that's right. Yeah.
So this is my 16-step sequencer. But of course, I said, he kind of went out of his way to make things difficult or to encourage you to like do things differently. So yes, this is a 16-step sequencer, but right here, is a 5-step sequencer. And he was known for doing like stupid stuff like that. And you kind of learn to love it. So you're like, whoever deals with 5 steps, it's not a power of 2, it's not 4, it's not 8, it's not 16, it's 5. But if you kind of just like sit back and like embrace it and just say, yeah, I'm going to use 5 steps for my sequence today, you end up with a bunch of cool stuff. So like he was kind of right into saying, hey, you should do this. So
he was putting restrictions onto the instrument in some ways, right?
I'm not sure if I'd even call it restrictions.
Or
I'm just
guidances, maybe.
He designs it in a way that enforces you to use it, that kind of pokes you a tiny bit into doing things a bit differently.
Right.
But what's cool, you know, if you have a 16-step sequencer and a 5-step sequencer and you have them go the full length, you get some really cool polyrhythms and stuff like that. So kind of known for that kind of stuff too. I'm not sure how deep y'all want me to go, but I'll just point out just like a few other, I won't necessarily sound demo them unless you want to hear them, but you know, there's a phaser here. So a really complex voltage controlled phaser. This one has like 10 stages. I don't really know how phasers work that well, but 10 seems like a lot, maybe. On the other side here, there's a spectral processor. So you can kind of think of this as just an EQ, but it's voltage controlled. And it's voltage controlled in such a way that you can do some really crazy stuff with it. So actually, I should probably show this one off too.
So I'm guessing vocoder stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So
Robot man.
when I learned that vocoders, all they really were was a voltage controlled EQ, that kind of blew my mind. So I don't think that's a thing a lot of people know, but it's super cool. So let's take my voice, put it in even. And sorry for the crackling there. My voice is actually going through the Buchla right now. Take the oscillator, put it into odd, and we will say that they influence each other.
There you go.
You can actually take one of the bands out of the EQ and have it control the frequency of your oscillator. So you can actually have it change pitch with the way you talk. So yeah.
Question, Nick.
Yeah.
So how do you use the Buchla? You use Logic, right? You get something set up, you get what you want, and then you record it into the Logic. Is that your way you work, or?
Yeah. So the way I work personally, and I've wanted to maybe soon, switch it up a bit. But basically, I have a DAW, and it's Logic, and I basically only use it as a multi-track tape recorder.
Yeah.
So I just record out of this. Basically, I take stereo out of this, record into that, do like a mild bit of mastering and level corrections and EQing, all that stuff. But that's it. I do the same thing with my Euro rack as well.
Logic is your tape machine.
Logic is my tape machine. But I think the really defining difference of Buchla versus Eurorack, I mean, you can get all the Buchla sounds in Eurorack one way or another, but the defining difference is the design. And Don was very focused on the way you interact with his modules. you'll notice one of the things that you'll notice about all the designs of all the fronts of the modules is every one of them kind of has a unique layout, with the exception of maybe the sequencer versus this matrix mixer up here. Everything has like a very distinct layout, and that's intentional. One of the things he said is, whether he completely succeeded at this or not, was that if there was a blind user of his system, could they feel their way around and kind of figure it out? So that was one of the points he always tried to think about when designing his modules. Another thing I really like about the Buchla design is it's very, very aggressively one knob per function, and it is very stateful. And what I mean by that is that say you power down your system and you power it back up. On a Eurorack, there's a ton of modules that have some kind of memory in them, and you power it off and it doesn't, come back on the same way at all. Your functions on maths are cycling versus, you didn't have them set to cycle before. On the Buchla, everything is knob per function, so you don't have to dive into any menus. The switches are like physical, like positional switches, versus, a lot of what's popular these days are buttons. And you press the button and there's an LED saying that it's on or off. And then when you turn the system off and you turn it back on, that state's gone. These are physical switches. And that might seem like a small thing to point out, but it really makes a big difference because it helps you much more easily see what's going on, feel what's going on, and kind of be sure of the state of your system, because everything is really well defined. What you see is what you get. All of these modulation buses here, they're all physical switches, and that design principle is really one of the main things that sells me on the Buchla.
Okay, hi, welcome to sampling.
Welcome, sampling. Very smooth, very smooth.
So I'm just gonna kind of dive right in. It's gonna be sort of historical and what can sampling do for you, kind of thing. Sampling, the history of it starts with, as with many things in the audio world, with tape. Yeah. Though it was also possible to do that with vinyl and other mediums, tape is probably the most well known. The idea that with tape you could record a bunch of stuff in a stream of time along this thin ribbon of tape, which is great because then you could rewind and play it again and whatnot. But then people thought, well, what if you actually physically cut the tape? And so you started getting into tape collage and musique concrète, where you could record a bunch of sounds on a piece of tape, then chop it up, and then stick it back together again however you wanted. If you had a couple of tape machines, then you could even start playing around with various iterations of the sound. You could start chopping something up, recording it onto the second tape machine, and then chopping it up, and you could just, turtles all the way down kind of thing. Musique concrète was the term given to a lot of the pieces that were created that way, and usually it was either science labs and or radio workshops and or universities that would start to experiment with this. And there was usually an association with the sort of classical music scene / the avant-garde part of this. And they would always give it noble titles like, concerto for violin and tape and whatnot. Canada was also involved in this. There's a famous piece called Dripsody that was created by the sound of recording a drop of water, but then being able to pitch that up and down and creating really neat flow of things. You can find that on YouTube fairly easily.
Well worth listening to.
Yeah, it's actually a really cool piece. I like it.
From one drop.
I'm mentioning the history because much of sampling is still based on that tape recording modality, And in fact, how most recording software works is still based on that modality, like tape transport controls. So play, stop, rewind, fast forward, that sort of thing. That all comes from the tape modality. Tape gave us some of the first early electronic music instruments, the Chamberlin and the Mellotron. What they were about was taking a recording of an acoustic instrument on a piece of tape and wiring it to a keyboard so that when you hit the key, it would feed that tape through, so you would hear the sound. I'm just going to blip over to, I am going to share my screen momentarily. There it is. I'm just going to do that. And there is our little Mellotron. So you have each one of these keys was connected to a piece of tape that would record a particular sound at a particular pitch. And you would get various sets of tapes. So you could get violin, you could get flute and whatnot. It's kind of an iconic sound in the sense that, the Beatles used it for Strawberry Fields Forever. There's always someone coming up with a new variation on a emulation thereof. And in fact, Logic, the software that I use most often, I'm just going to blip out of here for a second so that I can blip back in, try.
Oh, there we've got the Mellotron flute.
Yep. And can you hear it?
Do you have your audio settings in Logic to go to the Zoom driver? While he's doing that, I sent up, I put the Wikipedia link to Hugh Lacane, who was the guy who did Drip City, and then there's the example of the actual Drip City piece on YouTube. And
I didn't realize it was Hugh Lacane that did that.
Yeah.
Yep.
One drop. And I think it's like, is it 6 minutes or something like that?
Yeah.
I've done
really cool.
editing, splicing on tape,
Yeah.
and it is a gargantuan amount of work.
It's such a tedious pain in the butt. You wind up sitting there with this reel-to-reel and like shifting it back by like millimeters, trying to find the start of the sound, and then you mark that with a piece of grease pencil, and then you find do the same thing, finding the end of the sound, grease pencil, and then you pull the thing out and you make your cuts. Then you've got your like little 1.5-inch scrap of tape that you put somewhere that you hope to God it's not going to get lost. And then eventually you're like piecing these all together. And then when you're running it through, you pray that you did a good enough job for your splicing that the tape won't come off.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I'm just going to bring up the sound. Let me know if the sound is
a bit louder.
Getting?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So anyways, you can hear how it's doing the whoa, 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 whoa. That's meant to emulate the like start and end splice point of this tape loop you would get in the Mellotron. You can get a bunch of different other sounds, like they included the the flute. There was the cello. Famous thing about the cello. On the original Mellotron tapes, apparently there's one note, I don't know which one, but you can actually hear the scrape of a chair on the loop. It's I kind of like the sound, and I kind of like the idea of it. I always have had a soft spot in my heart for tape. But anyways, I'm going to just stop sharing that for a second. There are some people who experimented with playing the same note. So they would take the like copies of the exact same piece of tape, but play that tape at different speeds to give changes in pitch. There were benefits in terms of cost, but you would get this sort of chipmunking effect. I'll explain that later, but it wasn't always ideal. Eventually, digital audio progressed enough to allow for standalone devices to be able to record sound as a digital signal, so like streams of numbers. And then you could manipulate and play back those digital audio streams in specific ways. Now, in the early days, memory was super expensive and pretty limited, like insanely so, where you might get 2 seconds worth of sampling time out of your device. 2 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. You could stretch it out if you would record in mono, or if you would record with different sample rates and whatnot. And a lot of times people came up with ways around those limitations, which also led to certain sounds being iconic. One of the most common things people would do was to sample vinyl at a higher pitch, sample it, and then bring the sample down lower in pitch to try and extend the sample time. And that gave a certain quality to things. How some of that original digital hardware also has an influence today on how things are presented in software and how workflow happens. So sampling, a definition that most people would think of today would be sampling allows someone to record a sound. This is not always the case. Some samplers allowed you to import pre-recorded sounds. But anyways, it allowed you to record or import sounds. It would allow you to usually edit or manipulate the recorded sound to some degrees, sometimes lesser, sometimes more, and then allow you to play back the manipulated, edited sound on command, usually according to MIDI commands. So usually it would be, I'm going to record the sound of myself, to quote a Ferris Bueller thing, belching into a sampler, and now I can play that belch at different pitches and even make it into a melody. Or that one person who made a ridiculous amount of money doing Christmas carols with dog barks, the rap, 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 rap. Super simple sample. They apparently sold a ridiculous number of albums. Wow. Who'd have known? Yeah, like I mentioned, some samplers allow one to work with this, allow you to record your own audio. Others will only allow you to record audio that was recorded elsewhere, such as stuff called soundware. Used to be coming on CDs where you'd have like sounds of the Middle East, and it'd have a bunch of recordings of ney flute and oud and that sort of thing. Nowadays, it's more of a downloadable collection of sounds that you can download into the sampler. I will point out that some synths would allow you to work with a set of predetermined and pre-recorded samples, but they wouldn't allow you to import other sounds. So basically, you bought the synth, and what it came with was what you had to work with. These were often called romplers. Omnisphere is one such thing. Beautiful machine, but you can't bring in your own sounds to run through its processing. So in terms of practicalities, how you would actually do sampling. So you would start at your recording stage, figure out what you want to record. So is it a sound of a voice singing? Is it the sound of a trumpet? Is it a chunk of a drum beat that you want to see that you can loop? All that. So figure out what you want to do. Figure out what you want to do with it. Do you in fact want to loop that drum beat? Do you want to take that trumpet and make it into a whole pitched instrument that you can then play on the keyboard? Did you want to layer it on top of something? Did you want to use it as the starting basis for creating a sound that didn't exist? Figure out whether you want to do stereo or mono. Bit rate and sample rate would have a determination on the sound. So bit rate would make it sound a bit crispier / harsher. And in fact, there's things called bit reduction plugins that will reduce the bit rate of what you're doing to, in a sense, emulate that sound.
Bit depth.
Bit depth, thank you. Yeah. Bit depth, thank you.
Sorry.
No, thank you. Feel free to correct me. There was also a sample rate. Some of the samplers would only record at 32 kilohertz per sample rate. And this gave sort of a warmer / duller sound to it, or would introduce aliasing or artifacts into the sound that wound up being characteristic. Sometimes people would really love it and even seek to recreate that. Some of that had to do with the electronics that you would use to take a sound, like an audio signal, transform it into a digital signal, and then vice versa. There may have been other special sauce in the mix. I got to be honest, I wouldn't care to guess. there was also the annoying thing about codec schemes, what you would record that digital sound as. I'm going to share my screen again. Can you all see the quasar?
Nice.
This. So I'll be mentioning this later, but this is a list of all the different sampling formats this particular software reads. You'll notice there's quite a bunch of different formats. We're all familiar probably at this point with WAV and AIF, but every company had their own bloody sample format.
Why?
Right? I mean, you've got Korg, Akai. I mean, some of them even had different versions of their own damn sampling codec scheme. And there was a whole third growth industry of these different companies that would be able to convert one from the other, so that you could use your super expensive CD of sounds and be able to use it on both your Akai sampler and your Korg Trinity workstation thing. Sorry, I'm just gonna stop sharing for a second and hop back. And am I going okay? Everyone's getting this? Right. So you'd figure out what you want to record. You'd want to figure out your bit depth and sample rate. Some would allow you to figure out your encoding scheme. You would often manually set your record levels to try and get as strong a signal as you could. And then you would either start recording manually by hitting a button. You could have it cued by MIDI, so you could use a key on your MIDI keyboard to start recording. Or you could instruct a sampler to say, okay, start recording when the audio signal is louder than this level. Awesome, you've got your chunk of sound. It exists. You now can figure out how to edit it and whatnot. And often that just involved figuring out what the good bits are, selecting the good bit, and either cropping it out of the useless bits or trimming off the useless bits before and after. You would often find some companies would have a display big enough that it would actually show you the waveform, so you could use that as a graphical guide. Others, you just had to use your ears and hope you had a really good sense of timing. And, you know, it's just fine. Okay, well, I want here to be my starting point and here to be my ending point, and I'm going to take that chunk and do it as I will. So usually, well, some of the later samplers would select zero crossing points automatically. So if you didn't cut at where the sound wave was exactly zero, you would get these clicks at the beginning or the end, basically where you cut. So if you're trying to do a loop, it would loop, but you would get this click right where the loop. Yeah, and it was super annoying.
And then came software.
And then came software, and oh dear God, it made it so much easier. Some samplers would actually allow you to apply tiny fade-ins and fade-outs to the beginning and end of your sample for smoother transitions in and out of the sound. Some would do it automatically, just because that's how they did things, but people got annoyed with this because this could also affect the transients. So if you were recording drum stuff, it might cut off the tick of a kick drum sound, so you get the boom but not the tick, or you wouldn't get the full tick, and so much gnashing of teeth and consternation. Then when you're looping your sample, if you want it to keep on cycling over and over again, you have to figure out your loop start and stop points. I am going to show some visual demonstrations in a second, so to speak. You'd also have a bunch of different playback modes. One shot usually played the sample in full once and then stops. A variation would allow you to restart the sound in mid-playback, so you could get those stutter effects. You could also do looping. And sometimes you'd want the looping to sound exactly the same every time it went over. Other times, if you were doing like a voice singing a single note, you would hear where the loop started and stopped and would get annoying after a while. So you would try and vary where the loop started and stopped so that it would seem a bit more organic. I'm just kind of racing through. As I was going through this, I went through the big old thick book that came with my EMU hardware samplers and all the various functions. A lot of times you'd have, you know, basic trimming and cropping. You would be able to adjust the volume of the sound. often with the normalize feature, which basically meant it would analyze your chunk of sound, find its loudest point, and say, hey, that's not as loud as it could be in the digital domain. So I'm going to increase everything as far as I need to in order to make that loudest part of your sound as loud as it possibly can be, and everything else will be brought up that same level. You could also say, well, I want you to normalize, but not at that absolute highest. I want you to normalize it at a couple of dB towards the highest. So there would be different samplers would allow for different things. You could play around with your balancing of stereos. So you could make right or left louder. You could swap left and right. You could take the sample and reverse it, or even just take parts of the sample and reverse it, and leave the others going the right way. So you could have some really interesting effects. So I'm just gonna share the screen again and show some good old-fashioned pictures of some of the old samplers that were kicking around.
Who's used this hardware sampler? Okay.
So this one was the one I think everyone was drooling for. At the time, it cost about as much as a fancy car. And you have used one, and you have no idea how jealous I am. This is the Fairlight Computer Music Instrument, the CMI. I'm not sure which iteration there is, but yeah, in today's dollars, I think it'd be like $60,000 or something like that. Probably more. I do believe they've started playing. They have re-released this again. I seem to remember seeing that.
And I'll have to tell you that it was 8-bit, I think.
Yeah.
And I can't remember. I think there was maybe 8 notes in total. But yeah, boy, did it sound good. Like it just sounded so incredibly. I don't know. It sounded like a real instrument, for lack of a better word. And I don't know what sort of magic they were doing. But yeah, I used one in BC when University of British Columbia had one, and I was going to University of Simon Fraser, and my buddy, he'd give me the keys to the studio. Is what he'd do.
Again, I am insanely jealous. I actually remember going to, there used to be a keyboard place out in Nepean where I lived. And they had a few synths, and then they had a display of all sorts of synthesizers, including a picture of this one. And I'd read about it, and I was literally the kid, like pressed up against the shop window, fogging up the window, going, someday I'll own one. I don't have $60,000. However, I do have a version of it, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So anyways, that was the Fairlight. There were other original iterations of it. Sampling was really embraced by the hip hop community. And one of the more iconic ones was the SP1200 from EMU, which allowed you to have several sounds at once. And it was kind of like the Fairlight. It was kind of like a workstation in that it would have a sequencer. You see that it had 26 kilohertz sampling rate. So compared to today's 44.1 standard for CD and wave audio, and onwards up to 96 kilohertz or 192, 384, it was simple, and it only gave you a certain amount of sampling time, but people loved it. They loved that sort of crunchy, gritty sound quality to it, and you hear it a lot on hip hop records.
Anybody used it? No?
I poked at it. A friend of mine had one, and I poked at it and made one sound go and went, ha! And that was it.
Not a hip hop artist?
Not anymore. I may be yet again, but
yeah.
Then this is the modern iteration of it. It's pretty similar to how the original MPC 2000 XL appeared. This is kind of, I would say, the machine that really launched hip hop. its claim to fame was you could record sounds into it, including vinyl, and you could assign a sound to each one of these pads, and then use the pads to program your own drum beats and sequences. So you could say, okay, I want 4 bars of a loop that's playing on this, but I want to be able to add some guy shouting yo on this pad here. And then after those 4 bars, I'm going to switch to this, and I'm going to get 8 bars of this other loop I recorded. So you could literally build up your own song. And you could have several things running together and whatnot. It had a bunch of different features. A lot was made about the feel of the pads themselves. I don't know if I buy into that, but then again, I'm not really an aficionado. But this machine was kind of iconic in terms of what it did for certain music communities, but also how it shaped how certain workflows and audio happened. I had one. I liked what you could do with it, but it was a bit clunky for where I was at the time, and eventually I got rid of it. It just wasn't doing it for me. Then I got into rack mounts. I happen to like the company Emu. This is just a bunch of different pics of it. The early rack mounts were basically rack mount versions of these early samplers, or even dumbed down versions of it. But eventually they really started to get complex, and in some ways kind of achieved a golden age that software sampling has just started to overcome. And in fact, there's still a couple of things that you can do on, for example, the Emu stuff that you aren't necessarily able to do the exact same way you in software. So I've got a whole stack of these. And to be honest, that was often common. One of the other uses that you would use for these rack units, the hip hop folk would use it often to steal loops and chunks of sound to weave into their collages. Orchestrators would often load up entire instruments and orchestras of instruments into racks of these things and use MIDI sequencers to just drive them to create orchestral works. I mean, it was a huge labor of love. Dear God, I can't imagine doing that these days. Not with the software tools we have. But at the time, it was a lot cheaper than renting an orchestra. Every software, every DAW has its own software sampler. Logic has simple sampler and a more complex one, the ES24, is it?
No, that's all changed, buddy.
That's right. That's in the before times.
That's
all right. So it's got the simplest and the more complex one that I can't remember the name of. Then.
Oh, they've got Alchemy, and then now they've got the Quick Sampler, which actually allows you to record into it. Yay!
Yeah. It's an actual sampler.
And then they've got the sampler, which is their multi sample stacking thing. And all that. Yeah.
So Logic obviously is well equipped. Ableton has their simpler and their sampler. Reason has a couple of samplers built in. Excuse me. Reaper has the Resamplematic 5000. Never used it. No idea what it's like. Cubase came with sampler track and usually lighter versions of the Halion software. There are a couple of just sort of regular sampler third-party things. Togu Audio Line, TAL has a sampler that they put out. It's more of a character thing. You have a lot of software that has sampling integrated, including what I'd call super samplers like Falcon, Halion, Contact, where you have an insane number of capabilities on top of the sampling. Hey, I'm going to share and let's have a peek into Logic. This is the simple sampler in Logic, and so the idea is, again, you have this chunk of sound, I could play it in its entirety. It's basically a female singer going ooh. What we're just hearing is this chunk here, but I'm also looping it. And the LFO here is basically varying where that loop starts.
Right.
So instead of getting a static, you hear it every time it starts around, the back and forth sort of almost randomizes where it's going to start. So it makes it a bit more organic of a loop.
So you do hear that click you were talking about, though.
There should be a snap too on zero crossing, so yeah.
If you change the crossfade length to something just a tiny bit above 0, it might.
Yeah. Some samplers, especially the software ones, would allow you to actually slice up the audio according to transients, and you could actually mess with the timing between each of the individual notes and create different feels for your audio, for your rhythm loops and whatnot. Got to be honest, I really didn't do a lot of loop chopping. To me, that was cheating. I come from a player's background, so I wanted to be able to play my beats in real time.
Right.
I guess it was a pride thing, whatever. I'd mentioned using samplers as more instruments. One thing you used to be able to do, multi-sampling, where instead of just having one sound, and often when you tried to pitch that sound up or down, you'd get the chipmunking effect. You could obviously tell it's been sped up or slowed down. As well, if you're trying to vary the volume, like with a piano, when you hit it hard, it is louder, but you also get a bit of a sharper attack to things. If you tried to emulate that with just one layer of sound, you would get it louder, but you wouldn't necessarily get that sharper attack unless your sampler had synth functionality that you can emulate that. So instead, what people wound up doing is doing velocity zones and key zones. Different companies would call this different things. The idea is you would have the same sample stretched out instead of the entire keyboard, just a couple of notes. Some of the bigger libraries would even have a single note. And then even there, you would have different gradations. So if you hit your keyboard softly, you would play a sound. And as you hit it louder and louder, it would start feeding from that sound to another sound that would give a louder sound and sharper attack, and so on and so forth. So this one is a piano layered on top of a pad, for example. So that, for me, was when things got really kind of cool and creative, where you were able to layer things on top of each other and have them fade in and out. And even with some samplers, have one sound affect the other. Very cool. Love it. And I love the, I have only done a bit of playing around, but it looks super easy in the new complex sampler that Logic has. And I guess that is its name.
So the complex sampler, now that I'm looking at it, looks exactly like the old one they had, just with a UI that's been designed in the past 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. Was it the ESX24?
I think it was the EXS24, yeah. So this just looks like they modernized that and made it actually usable, because the old one was not.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to be honest, the older one I wound up using more for its, all right, well, there's a cello patch in amongst the presets that came with Logic. Okay, I'll bring that up and just kind of play around with it, as long as I didn't have to go too deeply into the
essentially a rompler.
Yeah, exactly. It was freebies and cheapies on the sampling side of things. There's a bunch of stuff that I came across. I'll direct your attention to Quasar Beach, though, a downloadable tool for all the different platforms. It is, if you scroll down, they are asking name your own price, but it's basically a recreation of that $60,000 Fairlight synthesizer.
Where it all basically started in the sampling world. This is where it started.
Exactly, including you were talking about additive synthesis before. Yeah. This allows you to basically draw your own harmonics and whatnot. This is also where I got here's where it gives you to import from all the different sample libraries. which just this functionality is kind of like, wow, that's impressive. There's stuff on the iPhone. I remember when I talked about pressing my face against the window and someday I'll own a Fairlight. Eventually got one for 14 bucks, so to speak. Someone ported it to iPhone and iPad.
Quite good.
So it's not without its issues, but it's cute. In fact, to start it up, you have to select the right voltage. Otherwise, the image on the screen starts to smoke as though you're running out at too high a voltage, which I thought was kind of an interesting touch. And it comes with all the, yeah. Then there's also Sampler, the sort of a more hands-on sampling utility. And then there's a lot of effects and synths that have sample functionality built in. There's a lot of granular effects that are basically designed to sample something and then let you use granular effects to play around with that sample. There's a few other freebies that I'll just very quickly mention, and then shall be done boring you about things you probably already know about. Actually, I've mentioned two of them: the Fairlight clone from Quasar Beach, the TX16WX. Valhalla, their space modulation plugin, is now free, and it's pretty darn cool. There's a whole bunch of other stuff out there, but that's what I got, and I'm done.